Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Graeme Summers. Still passionate about TA after all these years. It's about, it was 40 years gone February when I did my TA 101 back in 1982 with Patricia Clarkson. So she was a huge inspiration to me. And TA and the community around TA has been an inspiration in all those decades. So I'm still as passionate as ever and delighted to be here and to share and play with ideas with you and hear your input and what you make of it, and for all that to play into it. So, so I'm really excited to be here. Paul?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here as well. I've not done as much TA as Graeme, thankfully. So I've been doing TA for about 20 years, mostly in organisations and also more latterly with adult education. And I just love the co-creative TA, as Graeme and Keith know. Hence getting together with a group of my PTSDA colleagues who are using co-creative TA as well. So we were really pleased and excited that Graeme and Keith agreed to join us and do 8 of us, putting all these on for a year. So it's really nice to be here.
Brilliant. We hope that we have some fun this evening. You know, I think fun and learning go together very well. You know, so one way we might just start by off with is just Shadell, I loved, you're not on camera at the moment, but when you were on camera, you gave this wonderful animated thing like this. And that is actually really, really helpful when you're on Zoom calls, because it, you know, it matters. It really helps our interaction, the sense of being together, being animated and alive together, even though we're in this weird remote sort of format. So just for a bit of fun, I wonder, would everybody be perhaps willing to wave your arms or raise a thumb in the air or give an okay sign, whatever it is, just by way of saying hi and joining the group? Oh, I like the salute shot, and that's brilliant. Oh, fantastic. Great to have you all here. That's magic. We thought we might kick off with saying a little bit about why the idea of positive games is interesting to us. You know, so I'll say a few words, Paul will say a few words, and then we make a little bit of space to say, okay, so what's caught your interest? And it may be that you've looked into this idea before, so you have some, or you know, some thoughts, ideas, opinions, experiences stacked up. It may be that it's just, whoa, what a strange idea. I've never heard of that idea before, positive games. But you might even just indicate, okay, so what are you curious about? So that's, we want to capture some of this energy. So I've been passionate. I did, I did a TA 101 back in 1982. The first TA seminar I ever did, you know, the 202 seminar, we did these, I know, at the end of sort of metanoia training workshops. So I think that I must have done this one in 1983, 84 in that training year. And the first one I ever did was on positive games. It was on this subject. And it was really inspired by, I was doing a lot of work with adolescents. I was doing a lot of work with troubled adolescents. I was working with kids at risk of going into care, or maybe if they were already been offending, we were trying to keep them out of the system. So it's a lot of group work, and we used TA as a framework, and Patricia supervised that group work project. So my thinking about this whole idea of, you know, because we played a lot of games together, so really to take this idea of, to take some of what Byrne was saying about games and be applying it to healthy, positive interaction, has actually fascinated me from, you know, the beginning of my journey. And of course, that's, you know, that thinking has developed over time and has found its way into articles and books and stuff like that. So I'm very excited to be here, but that's the kind of the genesis for me. And I'm really happy to say more about that and offer some thoughts and diagrams. Of course, you can't have TA without diagrams. We'll have some of those thrown in as well, and give you a chance to play with this. So that's something about my, interest in this idea. Paul?
Well, I'll just admit somebody. There we go.
Brilliant.
Well, I always had a difficulty with Burns. Well, what I was taught in TA, that games always had a negative payoff, and I couldn't get my head around that. I just thought there's got to be positive aspects of our script, or else we wouldn't be here. We would have given up ages ago. So we all have some non-conscious, unconscious, positive aspects of our script about ourselves and other people in the world. And if games reinforce our script beliefs, then we've got to play positive games as well as negative games.
Assuming script could be positive as well as negative.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've been working on positive games for 2 or 3 years and done quite a number of seminars now, and it's a real passion of mine. Positive games in terms of how you really can become more positive and move up Burns' time structure to intimacy without going through negative games. So you could use positive games to get there. So that's what my passion around positive games.
Brilliant. Thank you. So let's hear a little bit from you. This idea might be familiar to you, or it might be brand new. But either way, why are you here? What's caught your interest to be in this workshop with us? By the way, not everybody has to speak. That's not a rule. But we'd like to kind of get some sense of what are you curious about?
So go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think I agree that there are positive games that I play, and that there are positive parts of my script that I want to keep. And I wanted to hear more about what that looked like in helping someone as a counsellor and a therapist, but also just, I suppose, confirm certain things for me, in that we don't have to get rid of our scripts in order to be authentic or to be autonomous, and that playing games, positive ones, is also a positive thing, and that we partake in games every day. And so just hearing more about what those might look like, the positive games, would be great.
Okay, brilliant. So it seems like it's an idea or an approach that kind of feels right to you, but you'd like to explore it a bit more.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Julianne. Chris, your turn now.
Well, thank you, Graeme. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I've thought of script. We are brilliant script-making creatures, I think. And so for me, I've always understood script as being a really vitally important creative function of humans. And so when I saw the original workshop game of positive games, that's what interested me in this. And just in what you were checking in with there, Paul, you went to speak quite quickly about positive aspects of script. And for me, it's interesting because I've never really thought about positive games before. But of course, as we know, TA ideas interleave, everything interconnects, doesn't it? So for me, what I'm hoping to take from this workshop is a deeper dive on how I could understand games having a kind of positive purpose in a similar way as to which I think once we can uncover our script, we have other script options that can be positive for us.
Yes. I love what you say. I resonate a lot with what you say there, Chris. I think as human beings, we're meaning-making creatures. One of the ways we make meaning is we create stories. And you know, and obviously that was Burns' narrative metaphor for you know for life patterns. And so it seems like, you know, that idea absolutely makes sense to you. And then of course positive games make sense in that context. Let's dig into it a bit. Great, thank you.
Graeme,
Hello,
I'm
Alistair.
to discover what the parallels are between, as it were, your negative games and positive games in terms of, you know, corresponding structure. Like, are positive games played out of awareness? Is there some moment of switch, of cross up, of confusion? Is there a particular payoff? And you know, how is the positive game then, as it were, discovered after the event?
What an interesting bunch of questions. And what I like about what you're doing, Alistair, is in a way, because I think the idea of negative games is so embedded in our theory, in the way we speak about TA, that with that then there's a whole bunch of resources that we have, you know, like all the structures, ways we think about negative games, and then picking apart, okay, so which bits of that might then apply to when we think of positive games, which bits might not apply? I think it's a really, really, really interesting question.
Yeah, because, you know, a game by definition is an unconscious process.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a brilliant question, and Paul and I will certainly have thoughts about that. But obviously, one of the benefits we get, you know, presenting this stuff is you teach us as well. You know, so you might see things or have angles on stuff that, you know, we maybe haven't quite crystallized or haven't seen, and that's all part of the collaborative exploration of the subject. So thanks for that, Alistair. There's some great questions in there. Rachel.
Yeah, I'm on the same track as Alistair, I think, coming with these questions, and coming as a little bit of a cynic, but willing to have my mind changed.
A little bit. What? Tell me about the little bit of cynic that you.
But I absolutely agree that and think about script in terms of we can have positive script, and there are many aspects of a game that I think can be positive and that could lead to a positive payoff. I can get that, but I think I'm with Alistair on the questioning of are we changing the definition of a game too much if we describe it as a positive game? And essentially I'm thinking about the switch and the cross up. So yes. Really thinking about Formula G, I can see positive games for most of the parts of the formula, but not for switch and cross up and the unconscious aspect, like Alistair said. And I kind of feel like if we tweak that too much, we're actually changing the essential nature of what Byrne meant as a game.
Very interesting, and it may be that you go away unconvinced. You know, maybe as you go away from this conversation. Now, yeah, I can, you know, they're talking about positive games, but I don't really think they're talking about games. And I'm going to stick with the definition that makes more sense to me. Absolutely fine if you do that. But what I'd love to do is kind of, you know, have some of this chewing together as a group about this. I think that would be great. So certainly welcome your cynicism, Rachel. Pete.
I guess, yeah, I'm here because I've had many conversations with Paul over the years about my struggle to understand this concept. And even as we're talking, I'm realizing that I don't know, I think there's something about the negative positive aspects of things that I don't know that I see games as entirely negative as they are with the definition that we have. In that I see them as part of a process of getting close to but missing out on intimacy. And as we bring games into our awareness and as we understand them, then I think that's a really positive process. And what I loved about game theory was making sense of how we might miss out on contact and intimacy with each other. Right. So I guess I struggle with the positive negative aspect of this, and I'd rather see, so I'm kind of interested to hear, because I see games as being on a kind of continuum of understanding what makes us tick. Just in the same way as script, I think I think too often, maybe in the past, well, I mean, everything that you've developed, Graeme, has been about having a broader look at something that was traditionally taught as negative, as how we were somehow less than, how we could improve and do things better. And I think actually, for me, TA is a great way of philosophically making sense of our condition. So I guess I'm interested to hear about having an idea of negative and positive games might broaden my thinking, because at the moment I'm really struggling to see what's traditionally called negative games as something that aren't positive in terms of us understanding ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It seems like, in a way, you're questioning the binary of positive and negative. Actually, yes, it can look, we could call it negative because it leads, it's repeating bad things. But if you embrace it, it's actually a signal, it's a call. You could, So I think that's a really interesting perspective, and so also something to reflect on and play with. So brilliant. Jackie.
Hi, hello. Yeah, and I just want to really build on and concur, and I'm just very, very grateful to Alistair, Rachel, and sorry, I get my glasses on, Pete, for what they've said, because they've kind of summed up actually a lot of what's going on for me. And so I just want to say to both Paul and Graeme, actually, I've been following the recordings sort of and listening to, so you're kind of my new best friends really, but without knowing it. And I'm loving this co-creative aspect and the positivity that's being brought with it. So James Sweeney is my supervisor, and I've been with him for 4 years, and quite honestly, this is the first time I've really looked into, and I kind of did it not for him, but out of respect, but actually joining in and hearing, positive script, positive games, and this whole conception and idea of this, it's really singing to me.
Okay,
and I'm really enjoying that.
So there's part of you that's singing, and part of you that's resonating with maybe some of your other colleagues.
Yeah, something about
Pete,
definition. Definition of script. Does it become altered, as Rachel says? When we think about the positive games, and Alistair mentioned about the unconscious aspect and how we think about it in terms of that, and so there's question marks over that for me, and but just generally, I remember when I was in training. I used to do group therapy, and there was this awful sort of, people used to say, "Oh, you're being really gamey," and it was very, very shaming. And it was, I'm thinking, well, we're kind of, I'm doing the best I can, and of course that's what we're doing, isn't it? The best we can, and so to find the positive spin on the game and how we can,
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, we've certainly got things to say about that, Jackie. Paul, I want to apologise. I've just got so excited with people being here. I've gone off on one, and think, give my co-worker space to kind of pitch in. I'm sorry, I just got overexcited. I'll try and regulate that a little bit. Paul.
No, it's fine, Graeme. I was having difficulty understanding what you were saying anyway. No, I think it is. I suppose for me, it comes back to, I learned, like I think most of you people are saying, that, game payoff, you get a negative payoff. And it's the rebellious bit in me that's saying, actually, you can get positive payoffs. They don't, because it's always a negative payoff. There's a switch and there's a payoff, and it's always a negative payoff, and it doesn't seem equitable that all the payoffs are negative. So you could call them constructive games, or non-negative ones or something, but it's just easier to say positive. And it gets people talking more as well.
it may be that as a group we come up with better words than positive or negative. I don't know. You know, it's like I sort of feel it's a bit of a journey, and it's a collaborative thing, that this is what we do when we talk with each other, or when people write papers or whatever. You know, we're kind of nudging the literature along, and always a question there, you know, I think about, so is this a stretch too far? Okay, developing it, but are we losing something that actually makes sense to me in terms of how I've understood this idea before? But I think these are all kind of process questions, in a process of playing with something different and trying to integrate it, and like working out, is it useful, and if so, how do I integrate it? Maybe it confirms that actually I was quite happy with the way I was thinking about it before. That's all part of the process. So welcome.
Should we get back to what Bern actually said a game was?
Yeah. Are you ready for us to move on? If anyone else does want to say something, then please do. But we're going to make space for this, just to say what we're going to do in terms of the structure. We're going to share some ideas with you. We include Bern a lot in these ideas, by the way. I think Paul and I are probably very Bernian, actually. So we're going to share some ideas with you, share some pictures, invite you to do some exercises, make space for dialogue, conversation, reflection, and see where we push each other by the end of the call. That's the idea. Is that okay as a framework?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, brilliant. One guideline: don't do anything you don't want to do. You know, it's purely invitational. Okay, that's the spirit. Shall I kick off then, Paul, by sharing my screen? Let me just
do your bit.
Right. Share screen. The magic of Zoom is upon us. Hey. So let me just see. Okay, everyone can see the word games there. Yeah, brilliant. That's a good start. Okay. There's more, honestly, there's more. This is just one word. There really is more. I'm going to kick off with a definition of a game from Bern. And this is from Games People Play. A game is an ongoing series of complementary ulterior transactions progressing to a well-defined, predictable outcome. So this is a definition of, I mean, Bern said many things about games, and he said many things about many things. And I think, you know, as you look at the TA literature, there's always the question about, well, he was contradictory here and there, so which version of Bern am I going to pay attention to, or which version of Bern am I going to choose? And this is a version of Bern that Keith and I chose to adopt in relation to games when we developed the ideas of co-creative TA. Paul, did you want to say something about ulterior transactions?
Well, yeah, because Bern went on to say the games were sort of a more neutral definition of a game. Games are well defined, but complex, repeated patterns ending in a switch and a payoff. So he was talking about repeated patterns, and then there's a cross-up. I think he originally called it a cross-up, or some confusion. And then that generates this switch. The switch is actually the confusion that's generated by something. Yeah. And he also said that a game had an exciting outcome rather than just dramatic. Or was it the other way around? It's dramatic rather than exciting, I think. But he was saying that it's not just something that just happens. And he also talked about games are integral and dynamic components of the unconscious life plan. or script of each individual, which is what we've been talking about generally. But then he said something that most people haven't actually read or took in. He said that depending on whether the script is constructive or destructive. So Bernie's actually saying that our script can be constructive or destructive. The corresponding games are accordingly either constructive or destructive. So Bern provided the mechanism for constructive, positive games, as well as destructive and negative games. And for those of you who are doing CTAs or whatever, and you want a reference, it's page 56 of Games People Play. But most people are quite stunned when I do that quote.
So he's talking about constructive and destructive scripts, and he's talking about corresponding constructive and destructive games.
Yep.
Yep. Brilliant.
Stunned silence or any comments?
I guess I don't feel stunned. And I kind of, as a transactional analyst, I realize I want to play with the word constructive, because I think even that is open to interpretation. And because I guess I'd come back to my same point that somebody may, I'm trying to imagine what a constructive script would look like, and imagining clients who, for whatever reason, still have some kind of low self-esteem issue, who may appear to be being successful and maybe appear to be getting the strokes and the payoffs that from the outside look positive, but who may say struggle with receiving positive strokes. I think there's something about the complexity aspect of this that I get caught up on the binaries, constructive, destructive. It feels like it's reducing a process to a tug of war, and yeah, I'm struggling with that at the moment.
And what I like about what you're bringing in, Peter, is perhaps more the idea of perhaps layered processes.
Yeah.
You know, you might have something looks destructive on the surface, but there's something constructive underneath, and maybe that layering can go back and forth between, you know, the apparent constructive and destructive out, you know, on the surface. I like that. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Any other comments?
I guess I'm thinking about the meaning of constructive, or what Bern might have meant by it. And I'm thinking of winning scripts, essentially. You know, that it's not a surprise to me that quote, because of winning scripts, but there was something about his ideas about winning scripts that it may be constructive for the person, but there's still something unconscious and therefore not autonomous about the process. And
like perhaps being successful for a parent or for your culture or something of that ilk. So winning being culturally defined.
Yeah. Which to me is slightly different than saying a positive game.
Yeah.
A constructive game is different from a positive game to me.
Okay, interesting. Any other reflections?
Can I make a comment on your definition that's on the screen? Because that could be just the definition for a racket rather than a game. And, you know, this has been discussed in the past in terms of the difference between rackets and games, and whether for a game you do need to end up with one or more crossed transactions. They're not all complementary.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly. We'll just keep playing with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it came to be understood that an essential component of a game was this element that at some point, after maybe a series of complementary ulterior transactions, you had a cross transaction that created the confusion.
Mm-hmm.
Where I was going with this in terms of theory is it's the Goulding-Kupfner diagram of a game, where a game is kind of mapped out in terms of transactions. Is anybody familiar with this idea? No?
No.
Because the way they talked about it was that actually the ulterior transaction is ongoing all the time. It's just at the point of switch, it becomes explicit.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's this idea of masking again, isn't it? This idea of ulterior, it's like, so at some level there's a socially plausible exchange. It kind of looks like it's adult, but the ulterior is going on all the time, and it's only at the point of switch that it's come into consciousness, and bang, you take the hit and the payoff. So I wonder if, that idea is coming into play here, certainly as we're thinking about transactions in games and in the relationship between the two.
And in that way, the understanding of the game is a tool for learning. Like, okay, you get the negative payoff, but the ouch means, well, what happened there, and what can I learn from it?
I think Pete's nodding away there in complete sync with you. Yes, of course. That's the positive aspect of a so-called negative game.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an ouch. It shows you where you hurt. So it's a bit like saying pain is negative. Well, actually, if pain's a signal that we pay attention to, it's a really, really good thing.
Yeah.
So I'm appreciating that's the perspective that you're holding here, which makes sense to me.
So Graeme and Paul, in choosing that definition from Byrne, the one that's on the PowerPoint,
yes,
are you, and using that as your basis of positive games, are you then discounting the later definitions of games that involve a switch?
Discounting, I don't know about.
Well, are you accounting for them in your definition of a positive game? Because I can see how you can choose that definition of a game and it sit with a positive game.
Yeah.
Can't see how you could choose Formula G.
No, it does. Formula G doesn't fit for me. Now, Paul might have a different take on this. I'd be curious to hear. I think Byrne was genius, actually, in terms of developing this approach to understanding what goes wrong with people. And I think, some of his thinking and the ideas he developed around games is stunning. So that, and this maybe comes to the point that you were raising, Alistair, that actually there are some ways in which Byrne talks about games doesn't really fit my understanding of a positive game. So I don't, Formula G makes sense in terms of those repeating painful patterns, but doesn't necessarily make sense to me in terms of a positive game. I don't know if you have a different take to me on this, Paul, or what do you think?
No, I think that you can do positive games within Formula G.
Oh.
Can you give an example?
Pardon?
Can you give an example? Because until I see an example with a switch and a cross up.
Okay. Okay. Well, if you can hold on to it, let's work our way to it rather than just let's go through a process.
Right, you've caught our attention here, Paul. So we're coming back to Formula G later on. I'm really interested to hear about that. So what we thought we'd like to do is invite you into breakout rooms and begin playing with this a little bit in terms of, we're playing around with theory and with ideas, but obviously, my experience is it gets more meaningful once we start talking more personally. So this is our invitation. We're going to invite you to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to flash up on the screen here while I've got still sharing with you the John James game plan. But the twist in this exercise is we're going to invite you to apply this to recurring positive interactions. You think about, the way I think about a game is it broadly, as I think about it as a predictable pattern of interaction. It's essentially how I think about it, with ulterior elements, and we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But here's a kind of a really, it's a colloquial way of getting into the experience. I like John James' game plan for exactly this reason. Usually it's taught with a focus on what keeps happening over and over again that feels bad in some way. This time, I'm going to invite you to think about perhaps a particular friendship. Could be a friend, could be a family member, could be a work colleague, whatever. But a particular person you might interact with, where you just seem to get each other, and you probably fairly predictably guarantee that if you get together and you spend a few hours together or have an evening together, you're going to come away feeling affirmed, and and them likewise. So just focus on that kind of interaction. So just guide you through this. Take a photograph of this if you need to, with your camera on the screen. You might just know the John James game plan anyway, because it's often taught in 101s. But I'm just going to go through the questions. What keeps happening over and over again? How does it start? What happens next? And then, how does it end? How do you feel after it ends? Perhaps how do you imagine the other person feels? And then we'll come back to the last question later. So that's it. That's it. Very simple exercise. I'm wondering, I'm trying to get to my, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Have you got that? Brilliant, because I want to come back to manage the Zoom breakout.
Can I just add, Graeme, because
sure.
certainly when in your Keith's co-creative TA article,
yeah,
you included what questions about what are the secret messages.
Yes.
And so I think that's really important, especially around positive games. What are the secret messages? And I've got
that is the last question on. Was the last question on the slide? It's like, I mean, I've paraphrased it slightly. I've said what underlying messages have been exchanged.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a slightly different way of paraphrasing John James.
So I suppose I'm inviting you guys to just think about the secret messages that are not being spoken and not being acted out. What are the ulterior messages that are going on that are secret? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to suggest I'm going to put you in pairs. I think that works out about right. 6 groups. 10 minutes enough time? A bit longer? Oh, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you.
Hi.
But kind of interested in your experience in that conversation. Anything you'd like to share?
Can I ask a question that we got to almost straight away and caught us right at the start? So,
yes, Kieran, you can.
I think I went into the breakout room thinking of me and my brother essentially sort of pastiming gentle, positive banter, but not necessarily intimate sharing of truths.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think someone was talking about like having intimate conversations with a friend where you're really telling truths. And so we kind of fundamentally were talking about two different, in our heads, we had two different kind of conversations going. And I suppose by definition, if it's an intimate conversation, it couldn't be a game, could it? Because you're being intimate and straightforward and saying what you want and asking for what you want. Whereas, so I was wondering, did you guys have one in mind in particular, what type of conversations or?
For me, I think they could go across a range, but I think a positive game often includes intimacy.
Right.
So to me, they're not mutually exclusive concepts. And that idea is true. And the way Byrne talked about time structuring, he didn't write about them as mutually exclusive concepts either. So for example, he often talks about activities, you know, like we could be going to play tennis. That's an activity, but within that, you could be pastiming, you could have a bit of withdrawal, you could have some intimacy, you could play a psychological game. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive ideas within time structuring. So,
I think we were
lovely
also
question,
getting,
Kieran.
we were also getting slightly confused about the switch up and what that might look like within the positive game. And the payoff seemed to be, you know, the sort of confirmation of the good things about ourselves.
So it sounds like you went beyond the exercise and you were bringing Formula G into this and saying it doesn't really fit, or, you know, it's a bit confusing. I think it potentially is. I tend not to use Formula G. I think it's brilliant for the problematic stuff. Less so for positive games, but then I think it sometimes applies, but not for me, not always.
I'm still struggling with I'm really struggling with the idea of games as taking place out of awareness, and the very definition of games being this is a kind of it's neither negative nor positive. It is simply a description of how we protect ourselves psychologically, but we're doing it out of awareness. And as I was talking through my understanding, I was thinking through the fact that I've always understood games as going alongside the drama triangle. And it's been mentioned earlier that, you know, the result is drama.
Yes.
So it's compelling, and it's the next best thing to intimacy kind of thing. And I was wondering whether there might be mileage in considering the idea of a positive game, which I'm still not convinced about. But does that involve instead moving over to the roles in the winner's triangle, where you know, instead of being a persecutor, you're choosing assertiveness, instead of being a rescuer, you're caring, and instead of a victim, you're open, you're presenting your vulnerability to the other. I wondered whether that might be a way of framing, if you like, what we're thinking of as a positive game. But then the problem that I then have with that is if I'm engaging in those behaviors, I'm moving more into what I previously understood as game-free autonomy, spontaneity. You know?
Okay. So you're raising some really, really good questions here, Chris. Paul, is it okay if I show a couple more slides here?
Yeah, of course.
To illustrate my answer.
So what you raised, Chris, is where we were going anyway.
Oh, okay.
Which is always perfect, isn't it, when that happens in a workshop? Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen again with you. And that's where we are. That's okay. Share that. I'm doing my navigating several screens simultaneously here. I'm going to put this one up next. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the adult ulterior transaction. One of the things that's interesting about Byrne is he only ever talked about ulterior transactions in relation to parent and child ego states. It was the only way he thought about it. He didn't think about it in terms of adult at all. So this is what it looks like. I'm just going to move this screen along a bit. The quote I'm going to share with you is from Daniel Stern in his 2004 work, The Present Moment, which I think is an utterly gorgeous book. And if you haven't read it, get it. There's a gem on every page. Quite dense, but it's an amazing book. So here Stern is commenting on a clinical vignette in which a therapeutic rupture between therapist and client has just been successfully navigated. And he suggests they are both learning implicitly that together they can work this kind of situation out. They are co-creating ways of being with one another. In short, they are implicitly learning ways of regulating their intersubjective field. This delicate choreography goes on mostly outside of consciousness. And for me, that's the link to the ulterior. So Byrne chose the terms, the social level and the psychological level, to talk about levels of transacting. And what Byrne says about that is, he said, they seem the most coherent terms available. They're not scientifically impeccable. It's how Byrne writes about his choice of social and psychological level. Given that he was writing in the 50s and 60s, that makes sense. My guess is if he was a more contemporary theorist, he might be using contemporary neuroscientific terms. So now, for example, it makes more sense for me to think about explicit and implicit as for example, Daniel Stern's using in this particular quote. The other thing that Stern talks about in this book, The Present Moment, and I really love it, and it's the distinction he makes between the non-conscious and the unconscious. Many writers use the terms interchangeably as though they're the same thing. Stern takes a different approach, and his colleagues at the Boston Change Process Study Group, they really kind of got immersed in this whole area. And so they reserve the term unconscious for that which is defensively organized. It's the ways in which we protect ourselves, out of awareness. And he uses the term non-conscious to talk about all of the other healthy, adaptive ways in which we interact, co-regulate. Think of the complexity of human interaction when you meet someone or you meet a group of people. The distance you keep from people, the things you might say, not say, your choice of words. You can't consciously choose all of that. A lot of it is actually quite is worked out at that non-conscious level. And this is how a lot of, how neuroscientists talk about a lot of our interaction. It's only a small percentage of this is conscious. A lot of what we do, which is healthy, good enough interacting, is operating at a non-conscious level. So that's where I'm coming from when I'm kind of talking about positive games and this idea of the ulterior complementary transactions. We're talking about stuff that's not necessarily in awareness, but is still adaptive. It's still really helping us in terms of regulating our space with other people. So that's a comment, Chris, on this whole idea of, yes, you could make a conscious choice to be assertive rather than be persecutory. Yeah, and at that point, you're doing something else. It's not happening at an ulterior level. But there might be all sorts of ways in which, in many of our, those interactions where you just click with people, there's a lot of that where you're bringing sort of non-conscious competence to that. And it might be stuff that you've never been conscious of, but you're using it anyway. It's part of the way in which you learn to connect and relate with other people and co-regulate affect as well. That's what I wanted to say about the conscious, non-conscious things. This is where I think there's a lot of our healthy interaction it's not consciously chosen. A lot of it is non-conscious and non-conscious co-regulation. And I think that's what Stern's speaking of here. The other thing I wanted to do, just to move on a little bit and respond to, thank you, Chris, for bringing this in. I call them triangles of repetition. So on the left-hand side, we've got AC choice, winner's triangle. And on the right-hand side, we've got that very familiar drama triangle developed by Steve Cartman. So that's the way in which I think about this. Is actually one of the, I think predictability is a human need. And there's a lot of play that's repetitious. You know, if you've had young kids, you know, at the time you've been playing Post Office again, you know, for the 50th time in the same morning, or you've watched Fireman Sam over and over again. You know, I used to know all the words to some of those episodes. That's how repetitious it was. But, you know, that idea that if you have a positive experience, you want to repeat it. The repetition, it's part of the bonding, it's part of the social interaction, it's part of the co-regulation. And I think it's really what Byrne was getting at when he was really saying, you know, the main characteristic of human play is not that emotions are spurious, but they're regulated. That's what we're doing when we have these interactions. And a lot of it is happening at an unconscious level, even if we might choose certain aspects of it. That's the way in which I would frame this, think about this.
Can I just pick up on that as well, Graeme? Because in the conversation we had before we started, I think of positive games using these, but instead of Graeme's headed them as triangles of repetition, I think of them as triangles of reinforcement. Reinforcing in a positive from the blue triangle, reinforcing our positive script messages. So when we are being assertive and caring and vulnerable, we are reinforcing those positive aspects of our script about us being a caring person or being honest and assertive and letting our feelings out and sharing feelings. And I think it comes back to empathy. If we are in the winner's triangle, in the blue triangle, we are being empathetic. We are empathizing. And if we think of a co-creative field in field theory, then that field becomes very empathic. Because we are reinforcing the positive parts of our script.
So you're getting some different ideas, perspectives from myself and Paul here. I'm interested in what's being stirred in you, a curiosity and irritation, something that delights you, whatever, you know, some obscure connection you might be making to your own, you know, other things that you know. Welcome your responses.
I've been looking at the choice triangle recently. I'm just starting to train myself. A recent assignment of mine had been on games. And so I'd been thinking a lot about maybe, I was really interested in what you were just saying there, Paul, as looking at it as a way of describing kind of like maybe linking into that non-conscious knowledge of positive interactions on, you know, being vulnerable or being caring and mapping kind of like what happens within our daily life, because that is maybe outside of our awareness, but it's kind of like the positive interactions that we're having. I'd been thinking pre-meeting up online here, I'd been thinking of, would it be a kind of like a case where you could kind of like use it as a therapeutic tool, or what do you think about that, Paul? Is that something that you could work towards with yourself or a client as placing, or is it really acknowledging kind of like your actions and where you are?
Can we stop sharing the screen, Graeme? Then we can see everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for the reminder. I've got so many screens running here. You know,
yeah, I think it also links into what Graeme wrote in Dynamic Ego States about this process of moving from unconscious defended to conscious defended to unconscious conscious non-defended and unconscious non-defended. Yeah. So you're moving away, you're beginning to notice your what Graeme was talking about was what's in our unconscious and what's defended. And we become aware of it through the work we do, either on ourselves or with our clients. And we can work differently with it once we notice it. We can choose to do something different in a conscious way And as that progresses and we get good responses, it becomes a non-conscious process again. But it's a very positive process because we're getting more intimate. So we can move towards intimacy using the winner's triangle and being and generating this co-creative, positive, empathic field. Does that answer? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I've got another example from a different field. So, you know, I was a psychotherapist for nearly 20 years, but for nearly 20 years now, I've been working in the field of organizations. So I coach people and I do leadership training. And there's one particular program I work on at London Business School. And it's fascinating because the skepticism is there. Well, before the exercise, it really is fascinating though, because the whole theme, the whole gist of the program is it's really building on positive psychology and a lot of, and it'll be teaching some of this stuff in a business environment where you've got people who've got very sharp critical minds is interesting, but it's often really revelatory for people. So one exercise we do is called reflected best self exercise. So imagine this. You're going on a course, and before you come on the course, you've got to send out, you've got to nominate several people that are going to be, you're going to ask them to give you feedback. Now, the classic 360 feedback you get in those environments is, you know, oh, what are they good at? What are they rubbish at? You know, and where do you get, you know, anything in between? And how could this person develop better? What do they need to do? Blah, blah, blah. This is a different kind of exercise. The exercise is, I nominate maybe a dozen people. It could be friends, it could be colleagues, up to you. But what you're asking them to do is write 3 short stories. And by a story, I mean maybe it's a paragraph. When have you seen this person at their best? Is the question. And often what comes back is really fascinating for people. To realize they've had, you know, they might have had a really positive impact. They've really moved someone in some way. And maybe they barely remember the event, or they remember the event, but they don't, you know, they've no idea of the significance of it for this person. But I think that's a bit of a, it's a bit of a dive into the pre-conscious, the way I think about it. It's like what might be just under the surface, some way in which I'm relating with people in a way that makes a positive difference to them that I haven't even clocked. But if I can see it, and often when people read the stories, they're in tears, it's not uncommon. It's really moving for people to see that sometimes it's the simple little things. Sometimes it's that give someone the message of feeling valued, or someone's interested in them or with them, or just chewing over. So, you know, that sort of stuff makes a difference. So it's an approach. It's a tool, if you like. It's kind of a psychological tool. But it's a tool that's often really useful. It gets people talking more intimately about what it means. You know, I get people to read the story slowly. Sometimes I get them to read it slowly in their own language if English is not their first language, and invite the group to respond. What are you feeling as you hear the story? So the invitation is to make it more of an emotional process. So that again is an example of, you know, there are a couple of ideas, you know, but there's probably just lots of different ways you might take this and say, okay, if I'm going to get interested in this as an area worth exploring. Yes, we could dig deeper into the pathology, but we could also dig deeper into the health that's already there, and that actually give people a language and a space to explore it, acknowledge it, to build on it. That's part of this frame, I think.
Lovely, Graeme.
Thank you, Katie, for your question. It's a great question. So you know, as you play with this, part of what you might be playing with is, oh, how might I even just experiment? You know, if I hold this as a way of seeing, not a truth, just one way of looking, then how might I use this for my own development? How might I use it as I'm wanting to support someone else in their development? We're interested in a feedback, question, you know, wave your arms about like we did at the start, you know, just kind of show us that you're all awake. And any other comments that just by way of staying connected with us and other people here. We'll take a few and then we'll probably have a little coffee break or a tea break or whatever you take at this time of the evening.
Graeme, what you're saying is lovely, and it's a rich, positive stroking, but I actually struggle to connect that with games as understood, you know, in a TA frame. And my concern has been for some time, because I've heard people move far too quickly from, let's say, the drama triangle to the Choi winners triangle, and it devalues the whole importance of game theory, because a lot of people are caught up in games which justify negative core script beliefs. And all of that seems to get forgotten, that we're talking here about a brilliant model for explaining, for example, transference and the reenactment of these pathological scripts. And all of that seems to be pushed to one side, as if it no longer, we don't have these problems anymore, but we do in the therapy room.
Well, it's not my frame. You know, I think, as I say, I think Bren was a genius. For me, it's not about replacing it. It's about putting something alongside it. And one of my critiques of TA theory for a long time was that it seemed to be overly weighted on the pathological. And so, you know, part of what I was interested in with Keith was, can we talk about these four core constructs in TA? You've got ego states, transactions, games, and scripts. The first two, yes, you could talk about health as well as pathology, but scripts and games were traditionally really had that pathological focus. For me, that was out of balance. I'm more seeking to redress a balance than take the focus away from the red triangle. I think it's a really, really useful tool, and I wouldn't discount it at all. But it's a fair point. And you know, maybe, you know, people approach theory with their own script as well. You know, if your script is to run away from trouble, then you're going to love this stuff. Especially if you kind of diss the difficult stuff. That's not my take on it.
And Alistair, you mentioned transferences there, and you said they were pathological, and I don't agree with that. Why can they not be positive?
That's not exactly what I'm saying, but I'm saying that it's a way into identifying that kind of a reenactment of early relationships, yeah. And how we, out of awareness, can play them over and over in a self-defeating way.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Laura, was it Laura? Were you waving before? Did you want to say something?
Yes. I sat with, this is a little while ago, I sat with some stuff with a client, and I was aware that I had some script beliefs about myself. And I found with this particular client, it kind of grew out of proportions almost. Mm-hmm. And I sat with a sense of possibly there's a sense of what's a countertransference and what's script in it. And my sense was the equation is I've got to figure out what's my stuff, and then I can kind of deduct, you know, the client stuff, and then I can deal with it. And it was all really good. And then I had a dream where I sat in the therapy room with my client, and I was aware all of a sudden that there was someone with us in the room. There was someone sitting behind me in the corner, and I couldn't see the person. It was just really dark in the corner. And part of me was like, oh, I hope the client hasn't seen this person. And at one point I turned around and I saw this person in the corner. It was like Frankenstein's monster. This being was part of lots of little bits. And I woke up and I thought, that's it. You know, we created this being in the corner, and I'm so busy stuffing this being away. And I think it's because I've learned it, and I'm year 3, is that countertransfer is so bad, script is so bad, everything is so bad, we have to kind of push it out of the room. And I think there's something about being curious and a bit like the Frankenstein's monster, maybe treat it with kindness and love and not fear and push it away, really. So
yeah.
I think when we sit with transference, it's always got this really negative stuff where we have to push it away and we forget to be curious about it. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and it resonates for me with how to bring the two together. It's not an either or; they coexist. So you know, the red stuff coexists with the blue stuff. It's not either or; they coexist. And you know, the way I think about it, certainly the way I think about it, both in terms of therapy and as an educator, is that how do we create enough of the blue stuff that we can safely look at the red stuff, and you know, and make sense of that, and then work through that, contain it, if you like. That's the way in which, ideally, you know, it's about creating the psychological safety for the emergence and perhaps the courage and whatever it takes to look at some of the stuff that's really painful, hard to look at. But how do we create the conditions for that? And I think that's, for me, is where I think of the red and the blue working together. But if the red's kind of taken over everything, then you break the frame, you break the safety. A game gets acted out rather than a negative game gets acted out rather than held, contained, stayed with, explored, you know, which would lead to, you know, therapeutic progress. Jackie, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to share something with you. And it's once again going on the back of what Laura was saying. And this was such a beautiful piece of work that happened. I had still the client who, she was 14 or so at the time. And one of the pieces of work we did was, it was about how would she deal with the irritating guests of hers at the party. So we thought about who would come to the party, these different parts of us with these various script processes, and then how she felt about them, and how we could work in a way that would basically, you know, give them some compassion, those different parts, and make them tolerable and live with them.
Nice story.
It was a lovely piece of work that she did,
yes.
In her own way.
And how do you make sense of that story in relation to the ideas we're exploring here, Jackie? I could make some associations myself, but I'm curious.
Well, it was really, you know, taking those sort of negative, as Laura was saying, that bad thing, those negative parts, or have we, you know, behaviors that we have, scripts or games that we play, and tolerating them and having compassion towards them.
Yes.
And so that, you know, we might have to live alongside them for a while until we can produce something different, a different outcome.
Yes.
So it's something about blending, as you said, Graeme, the red, if I understood you correctly, the red and the blue.
Yes.
And rather than being one or the other, but how we work from one to the other.
Yes. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Your story really resonates with, you know,
good,
how I'm thinking about it. It's a lovely illustration. Thank you. Pete, okay, I'm delighted you've got hands up. It's fantastic. We are going to take a break in a minute, so I'm going to ask Pete for that last question before our tea break, and then we'll pick up. Lee, I'm sorry, we'll come on. We'll pick it up after a tea break.
I'll keep it brief. I was just thinking about the roots of co-creativity and how I love the Allen's article on constructivism, and just thinking that I think the struggle I've had is with this kind of positive negative thing, because for me, if I put all of this within a constructivist frame, then it kind of makes sense, this continuum around the concept of games and the need to recognize and work with what we framed as negative, rather than get caught up in this. I'm really struggling, and I realize how much I struggle with the positive as well. It's kind of, and I think part of that is, is having looked at positive psychology and kind of being freaked out by some of that stuff. But I like the idea of this being a very constructivist approach to games.
What is it about the constructivist twist that's helping you perhaps tolerate this the positive negative idea, or something like what I'm curious as to what's making a difference for you now, Pete.
There's something about the idea of working together and framing and understanding together and working and bringing everything to the table.
Yes.
In terms of our work. And I think sometimes when I'm presented with a kind of positive frame, it feels like I'm not allowed to bring it.
Right, okay.
Well, I think that's a more traditional view in
yes.
terms of where we can sometimes be with TA and with this negative positive.
In our original article, Keith and I, there's one sentence here I just want to play back. And it's where we're talking about this duality of relating. We've got the past-centered, we've got the transferential dynamics going, some of which might be very toxic. We're building something different in the here and now between us. And the way we put it was, this duality of relating, in other words, the transferential and the here and now, enables transferential phenomena to be experienced, compassionately identified and contained in the relationship. So for me, it's not an either or. It's both. And I'm against this whole idea of that somehow, if I do all my therapy, one day I'll be cured. Like I've given up on that a long time ago. I don't think that'll ever happen. It's more that, okay, how do I keep bringing present-centered resourcefulness, compassion, containment, boundaries, all the things, the stuff I need to navigate life well? How do I bring that to some of the most painful, disturbing, disruptive emotional experiences I can feel? How can I do that? I am anticipating I'll be doing that for the rest of my life. Yeah. And that will be my ongoing struggle. But I think that's just being human.
I think that's really good, Pete, as well, because with the constructivist frame, what you're doing is by working together in that co-creative space, you're generating a new narrative that we're creating together. And that's a process whereby the old narrative for the client can move, even if it's incrementally.
I had a therapist once just on this theme, and it's fascinating. And I've been in therapy for a number of years before, but I want to see this particular therapist. One of the things we were talking about, my history, my mother's physical violence towards me. And one of the things that she was really throwing up was the possibility that there might have been protective intent behind that violence. I mean, this is all in the context of, and it was a brilliant therapeutic process. It was really about looking beyond me and my mum and the knot that we were in, and actually looking more systemically at, her experience of being a working class woman, and obviously the violence she was subjected to, but the whole thing, and really putting it more into an oppressive framework that, you know, actually sometimes if you grow up as an oppressed minority, you've tried to protect your kids by doing to them the bad stuff so they don't expose themselves in the wider world, you know. So it all made sense, and it made sense alongside actually working through my rage and fear and pain and all the other stuff that went with that life experience. But that was another story that emerged. It could only emerge perhaps at a particular point in my own therapeutic process, but it could emerge in such a way it actually helped me look beyond me and my mum and look at more broader systemic patterns that, you know, I was, you know, we were part of. Partly we were acting out. I just went a little bit deep there before a tea break. I thought you might like a tea break while we kind of just to break the pattern a little bit. Keep your curiosity, keep your questions. We'll pick it up in 10 minutes. Lee, I'll pick up your question there at that point as well, and we'll proceed further. Is that okay to stop there? Magic. See you at 1942 UK time. That's just in case of you're zooming in from elsewhere. See you then. Or a thought that came to mind, and I'd also like to pick up Lee. I know you made a gesture as though to ask a question. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Well, just firstly, just to put my voice in and say hello to everyone. I got the time difference wrong. So I thought we were starting at 6 my time, but it was 5 in the morning. So
wow.
Yeah. So I woke up a little bit dazed coming in here going, okay, sit down, and then went right into the middle of going, hang on, this is weird.
Incredible. Where are you calling from, Lee?
From New Zealand.
Yeah, whereabouts?
Christchurch.
All right, okay, lovely.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm holding a bit of disappointment because I'm quite interested in positive games. I don't know a lot about it, but I've formulated some ideas around that. So I realize I've missed probably the definition and all that. But Alistair's comment kind of stirred some interest and thought in me, particularly the exchange between you and him. So kind of want to respond to that, but I firstly just put out the own way I've been thinking about positive games, because I'm curious where it lands, because I've missed the first part. So the way I've thought about positive games would be that they generally would come from a parent or child state, because it'd be a kind of unconscious or non-conscious way of getting needs met, which is, rather than being maladaptive, like a negative scripty, rackety thing, it's adaptive and it's useful for us. It gets our needs met, but I was thinking it probably wouldn't sit within integrating adult, or if it did, there'd be some contamination in some way. So that's where I was kind of holding that coming in. And so hearing Alistair's comment, it sounded like, Alistair, your concern was that by focusing on positive games, it in a way be kind of avoidant or defensive of the say the negative elements, and missing out on the opportunity to work through that and transference, etc. And the way I'm looking at positive games would be, it's kind of like two sides of the same thing, and rather than so much like a dichotomy where they're quite apart, the way I see it and use it so far is that positive games for me present just as much opportunity to explore, because it's the same patterns, same dynamics coming up, but just a different flavor of it. So I have clients that are really have the same kind of towards positive stuff, sometimes even more so. So we get to explore the adaptive function of the positive game, but also what it's in a way defending from, like, well, what are the defensive elements within that? So that's, yeah, when I heard your I guess criticism, that's where it kind of landed for me, in the sense that I think positive games, from my understanding, can and do address the negative elements. It's just all in the same sphere, just different flavors.
Nice one. I can really hear you chewing this over, Lee, which is brilliant. I think
you had about 5-10 minutes to do that.
Good.
I think my problem, Lee, is that I just still don't know what a positive game looks like. Is it more than playfulness?
I'm with you, Alistair, that I kind of feel like I need an example, because all the examples I've been chewing over, I can put down to one other aspect of time structuring, including play, that Cornell and Bond and the Boyds wrote about.
I think play or playfulness can be part of it, but I think if I think back to the exercise I was inviting you to play with earlier on, talk about this maybe special relationship where you can, fairly confident that you're going to meet and you're going to have some sort of mutually enriching exchange. I don't think that's necessarily just play. It might be a kind of vulnerability or a sharing. And what's interesting, I think, is sometimes how, just a very short example, I was going to work with a group at certain premises, and I worked there many times before, knew people around, even though I wasn't working with them, and I met one guy there who I'd had a connection with in terms of previous work, and we kind of just had a mutual exchange. Oh, hi, how are you? What's, that sort of thing. And he says, oh, how are you? And I said, and really what I wanted to say was, I said, oh, my mother's passed away, recently. And I was, for all my intention, my conscious intent was to share the news or share the story. What was a complete surprise to me is how I just welled up in tears. And that was something about my relationship with him at some implicit level. There was a trust there between us that got re-stimulated in that initial contact. And I ended up kind of, like just welling up in tears. And it wasn't, I was kind of not expecting that. That's a little bit of an example of perhaps the cross-up or the surprise that Paul was referring to, in terms of Formula G. But I was kind of hoping that as you were exploring that exercise of this familiar, trusted friend or colleague where you have these conversations, I imagine you're doing much more than play. I imagine you're exploring things together in your conversations, and maybe as you're opening up to thoughts and feelings about those things that you would maybe just do with that person, and maybe it's not with others, or not to the same level. And I think there's something there about this implicit relationship that allows things to happen, but it's based on that complementary, ulterior, implicit trust that's being built. And sometimes that's not, you might be conscious of it to some level, but the surprise is what you might end up talking about, or the ways in which you might end up feeling. So that would be an example for me, is how I would think about that.
The thing about play, Graeme, was not that it was all about play. I was just using that as another.
Right. Okay.
So Cornell and the Boyds wrote about play being another aspect of time structuring, between games and intimacy. My point was all the interactions that I can think of with a positive payoff, if you like, I can put down to what one of the positive aspects of every other aspect of time structuring, including play. You know, whether that's activities or rituals or play or intimacy. And I guess I'm wondering how your example there, you know, lovely example, but why is that not intimacy as opposed to a positive game?
Because I don't think it's mutually exclusive. So I think intimacy is often part of a positive game. I don't think it's either or. And I think that for me, the value in conceptualizing this as a positive game is that it's accounting for non-conscious relating, which is actually a hugely significant, you know, aspect of human experience that that I think we somehow skip over in TA if we only think of adult as consciousness.
So is that the differentiation? Are you suggesting that intimacy is always conscious, but a positive game has got non-conscious?
No, I'm not suggesting that.
So what is the difference? What is in a positive game that is not in intimacy?
It's the it's the ongoingness. It's the ongoing series of complementary ulterior transactions. So before you get to that point of intimacy in a particular exchange, it probably hasn't just happened. You've probably been warming up to that. You've probably been warming up to that in anticipation of meeting the person and being with them. Maybe you're going through a few rituals that are typical of you and that person. So it's not just like straight into intimacy. It's an ongoing process of ulterior communication, which is the communication of respect or affection or liking or whatever it is that greases the wheels. Kieran.
Oh yeah, something just occurred to me, and it might help me to get my head around these bits a bit. I was on a training with Paul about 2 weeks ago. I think it was transformational learning, and I just suddenly remembered he mentioned positive racket. I'm not sure if he said positive rackets or positive racketeering. And kind of tonight, I'm kind of getting the impression that sort of you don't want us to get hung up on like applying Formula G to the game, and don't get too hung up on the switch. It's more of a. So I'm just wondering, would you both use positive racketeering and positive games interchangeably, or would you separate them out as different things in this context?
Well, I think the only difference is you don't need anybody else to play a racket with. And to my mind, positive racketeering is part of the prelude to positive games. Because so what we do with racketeering, isn't it? We generate a symbiosis where we both get a script belief reinforced. And if you're doing it from a positive perspective, we can find a healthy symbiosis where actually when we're being co-creative, the symbiosis switches from this way to this way, depending on the needs and the vulnerability and how we are in that relationship, how we share the responsibility between us at different times. And if we share our own experiences and we provide support and nurturing, and we can ask for it if we want it. So it's a positive racketeering, to my mind, is that we racketeer, but we switch from parent-child that way to parent-child that way. So it becomes very healthy rather than an unhealthy symbiotic relationship, which is always one way.
You do realize, Paul, that the term racketeering originally came from the idea of manipulation.
Absolutely.
To get our strokes in a kind of underhand sort of way, you know, a manipulative way. So I'm not quite sure what positive manipulation is.
Okay, and racketeering is out of awareness. So it can't be manipulation, because that's different. Manipulation is thoughtful, is processed, is conscious. Rackets are not conscious.
Manipulation can't be unconscious.
Say again.
Did you just say manipulation can't be unconscious?
okay, so the definition of manipulation is processed.
And racketeering
is unconscious by definition.
I kind of am a bit gobsmacked that you would say that manipulation can't be unconscious. I think that
okay, if it's unconscious, it's a game or it's a racket. If somebody's manipulating, they are doing it at a conscious level because they know what they're trying to get.
I disagree. I think it can be conscious and it can be unconscious. I think we can manipulate without knowing that we're manipulating.
Well, that's a game.
Yeah, absolutely. that's the point.
It's interesting, isn't it? How, you know, it matters to us, doesn't it? You know, like ideas matter. Perhaps the assumptions embedded in ideas matter. Something either resonates as meaningful with us, or even kind of we have a repulsive reaction to it. So I think, you know, this whole process of coming to terms, you know, literally we come to terms with life, we come to terms with experience, and TA as a framework that, you know, that we might use in different ways. And what to me is fascinating is how, you know, we can use the same terms and yet people use it with such different meanings and different intentions. I don't actually have any particular investment in you agreeing with me. I'm more up for the crack, really, for the debate and the stimulus, and I'll get, you know, and trust. I hope that we'll each get something from it. You know, that's my take on this.
I am invested in clarity and understanding, Graeme, you know, and I really do want to understand what you mean by your terms.
Sure.
And you know, that's why, you know, I've been talking, because I have been struggling to really get it from your frame of reference.
Are you getting any clearer, Alistair?
Not really.
Well, are you getting even a little bit clearer about my understanding? Even, I'm not asking you to agree with me, but even if you disagree.
Well, I just think that you're trying to stretch terms rather than just use different terms. You know, to redefine a term is not always helpful, rather than just to use a different term, like, say, whether it's playfulness or you know, something else that conveys what you mean.
Okay. I think it's different from playfulness, and I think there's something about the way I understand Byrne in almost in a temporal sequence. Is he talked about ego states as states of self. He talked about transactions, what happens when you begin to interact with people, and how you can, you know, capture this moment of interaction. And then games, when he's then talking about sequences of transactions, patterns of transactions. So for me, that really fits. So the idea of a game as a pattern of interaction, it really fits for me as a way of making sense of health and those good enough interactions, and what happens within those interactions. And of course, I've been selective about what we pick from the literature, because Byrne was contradictory in so many ways. So I've been selective about which model of ego states to use, been selective about, you know, the way I think about transactions and games. But for me, the opening definition that we started out with, that it's an ongoing series of complementary transactions leading to a well-defined outcome, absolutely fits my experience of healthy interactions and healthy relationships.
Yeah, I think it goes, for me, the understanding of games goes beyond your chosen definition, which, as I say, in the beginning was also understood to possibly fit rackets, racketeering, and what was the difference, you know? I mean, I think that it's you see, well, what would you understand by being game free, which seems to me a good goal, you know, to learn.
That's precisely what I wanted to challenge in the literature, Alistair. So because the way in which traditional TA is often being talked about is you have games. Games are not really very good or very desirable, and the object of therapy or development is to become game free. The same of script. You know, script's a bad thing generally. And what we don't want script, we want to be script free, or we want autonomy. So that's a whole construct that developed around traditional TA that I didn't like. Wanted to find a way of, I think the powerful models, I think what Byrne did was genius, but I think he missed a trick. I think he missed a trick in talking in terms of the potential to think of games and script in healthy terms as well as pathological. Jackie.
Yeah, I was just wanted to go back to what you said, Paul, about the I'm going to get this all around the wrong way, I know, if I try and put it in order, the non-conscious defense, the conscious defense, and going through that process. And that really makes sense to me about the positive game and getting to that place of unconscious non-defensiveness. And so we're sort of, it's almost fluid. This whole process is a flowing process, and we're going from that conscious non-defensive, which to me actually, did I say that right, looks like positive unconditional positive regard. Something we're thinking about and we're putting, and then we integrate that into the way we are, and are able to then engage in positive games. So that's that's how I'm understanding this process.
Resonating with this.
Yeah.
And I think that's the process that we go through during our TA training and our TA journey, isn't it? We notice these negative script beliefs, we notice our drivers, we notice the games that we're playing to keep our script beliefs in place, and we work consciously to notice them and not do them. So we bring that defensive, that unconscious defensiveness into our awareness, and we work in it with it in a conscious way. Then we do the positive, the opposite, the non-script, the challenge, do it differently, and we find that it's okay, and the earth's not opened up and the lightning bolt's not come down, and we're still okay. And we actually, in terms of narrative and constructivism, we change our story. We don't have to be defensive. We can express our feelings. We can be vulnerable. We don't have to defend ourselves. And as we go through that process, it becomes less conscious, so that it just becomes part of who we are. And that becomes a really positive part of our script.
And that's what Graeme was saying. Well, what I took from what you were saying, Graeme, about the exercise you did at your, business coaching, or, sort of almost the unsaid things that were brought out in that exercise. Then perhaps the noticing of humility, or whatever came out of that.
And the deepening in that process. And it's. I think when that works, whatever the context is, whether it's an educational context or a clinical context or organized or whatever, when it works, it doesn't often, it probably doesn't just happen. There are things leading up to that, things that nudge the process along, ways in which trust is built gradually, such that a transformative moment or a moment of meeting can happen. Which is why, and I think that moment of meeting is probably the intimacy. But I think there's an awful lot that has to be in place for us to feel psychologically safe in order to step up to that moment, or to be in that moment. Which is why, for me, this idea of ongoing complementary ulterior transaction really resonates and makes sense. And it might be very incremental ways in which trust is built that can lead to that moment of intimacy happening.
And don't just remember that ulteriors can be contiguous with at the social level. They can reinforce the social message. They don't have to be manipulative.
But you won't get that from Byrne.
No, you won't get that from Byrne.
Byrne talked about ulteriors exclusively in terms of parent and child. But we know a lot more now than we did then. Can I share a few more ideas with you?
Well, Laura's got a hand up.
Oh, okay, Laura, hi.
Sorry, am I jumping in? Sorry, Paul, when you said about the positive racketeering and you mentioned symbiosis being switched, I got really confused because my understanding is that the co-creative is trying to move away from parent and child, and it's to expand the adults. And I find it very difficult having a positive picture of something. I mean, that we can't even have contamination, can we, in co-creative? So I find it very difficult trying to find a positive spin on a child and parent.
Okay, well, I think it depends. You go back to which models you're using. If you're using integrating adults, then you can choose to be nurturing from your past experience. You can choose to be needy from a past experience. So your parent and child are coming through your adult.
Okay.
Or perhaps another way of playing with this. Tell me if I misunderstand you, Paula, but another way of thinking about this is that it's how might you shift gears in a relationship so that you might be moving away from a symbiotic pattern of that where the archaic ego states are involved. It's all parent and child being passed backwards and forwards. House of Commons is a great example, by the way. Very sad to say, but it's true. And then contrast that with the ebb and flow of adult to adult contact, not just consciousness, but also pre-conscious and non-conscious levels. The implicit relating, the implicit trust that happens in good enough relationships. There's still an interdependence. So maybe it's what we swapped codependence for interdependence. So the idea is not to be an autonomous individual. It's actually to have more healthy relationships, to perhaps be more interdependent and codependent. But be another way of thinking about that transition.
So the sense of adults kind of almost like complementing in how it expands. Okay.
Yeah. So if you know a functional fluency model, you would be using your structuring and nurturing to support somebody who was needy. Yeah.
Can I share a couple of diagrams? Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Shadell. Here we go. Share a screen. Where am I going? Yes, go to that one. So, in playing with these triangles of repetition, oh no, I've shared the wrong screen. 1 second. Actually, it's good enough. Just bear with me. Rather than change that, I think we'll just run with it. Back to this, reincorporating this definition from Byrne. The essential characteristic of human play is not that emotions are spurious, but that they are regulated. Actually, one of the main reasons we interact with other people is so we can help each other regulate emotions. It's one of the reasons why we need to interact. So in image here, you've got an image which looks like, whoa, the red's really dominating here. You know, I might be trying to put you down, you might be trying to put me down, you know, these archaic dynamics going on. Maybe we're stuck in a parent-child complementary transaction, I don't know. But the aim is to get here. The aim is to be building this blue loop, building the implicit relationship, building the interactions, this ongoing series of ulterior transactions. That's the way in which we're developing the present-centered field. And when we do that, we create a safe container that helps us, enables us to be able to look at some of the difficult stuff, some of the painful stuff, some of the stuff that's usually disruptive. We can then have the safety of a containing relationship, which helps us look at that with some courage and confidence. There's one final diagram I want to leave you with, and I just want to share this idea because I've really been playing a lot with this with my partner Sue Eusden and a TA colleague. It was Sue that introduced me to Panksepp. She's a trained biologist and has been fascinated by neuroscience for decades. And she introduced me to Panksepp's work, which is fascinating. So really looking at mammalian emotional systems, and he identified 7 systems that that are essential for our development. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but he talks about the seeking system, and we need to reach out, we need to connect with our environment to find food, to find love, to find whatever. The panic grief system that kicks in when our when our attachments are ruptured. You know, the attachment experiments. The strange experiment where someone walks out of the room, the parent walks out of the room, and the distress an infant goes into, that's the panic grief system kicking in, because we need to have that attachment maintained for our survival. The fear of being eaten, rage, you know, when someone violates our boundaries, we need to be assertive, we need to set our boundaries. Care, the importance of care, and particularly as a reciprocation of the seeking system. You know, we have a care system that kicks in, that it almost hurts to hear our child distressed. That's our care system kicking in. We need to respond to that. So these are all our adaptive systems. Play is a system that's got a lot more prominence lately in the literature. For all sorts of reasons. It's not just a nice to have, it's also essential to our evolution and survival and our ability to connect and communicate, and our social bonding normally is mediated through play. Lust can be great if it's associated with seeking, play, and care. It can be tragic if it's associated with rage, fear, panic, and grief. So lust is a free-floating system, and depends which other systems we attach it to in terms of how we'd manifest that. So playing on this idea from Byrne that, why did he choose this word games for what we call psychological games? He chose it because of this essential characteristic that we're trying to regulate emotions. So one of the things that Sue and I have been playing with and talking about forever, we promise we will write it up one day, is thinking about exactly this, that, you know, in our good enough relationships where we're building this blue loop, we are creating the conditions for co-regulation, for helping each other regulate our different emotional systems, the whole range. Yeah. And of course, some of our, trauma, developmental challenges, whatever, may have overstimulated some circuits. So our rage system, is kind of hyper, ready to kick in. What are you looking at? Or our fear circuit kicks in immediately in response to something we perceive as a threat. Some of these systems get hypersensitized. The systems that get underdeveloped, then the work is, how do you actually put these systems back into a proper perspective? We still need them, but we don't need to be trigger happy. And how might we develop these other systems that might have been underdeveloped? Maybe we've, for whatever circumstances, our care or seeking or play systems are underdeveloped. We need to give those more attention. So we're looking to get this balance in a much more healthy way. So the way Sue and I were thinking about this was that this is where the healthy games comes in, the positive games. It's like we're figuring out how do we regulate these different emotional systems between us in our interactions. And if we are doing that well, we'd say that, we're operating within that integrating adult, which isn't just conscious, it goes all right down to non-conscious implicit relating. Or we could be attempting to regulate these emotions by kicking off from parent or child, these fixated, perhaps defenses created in response to trauma we can't manage. That would be how I would almost define those archaic ego states. So I think in a way, one of the points I really wanted to make here was when I talk about positive, I'm not talking about happy clappy. I'm not talking about tree hugging, always smiling, serene monk. I'm talking about being actually, a fully vital human being that has a whole range of emotional aspects. And you have both the something of the experience and perhaps the confidence that you can actually get the help you need from other human beings to help regulate you, at those difficult edges. That's the way in which I would think about this, and why I think, coming back to Byrne's definition, why I would prefer to use that to keep the idea of games. I think it makes sense, but to balance out Byrne's focus on pathology with a focus on healthy relating. Fully respect if you prefer to use another term. I think that's fine. I'm sharing with you how it makes sense to me. Paul, did you any thoughts on what I've shared so far?
No, I think your diagram, your moving diagram with your loops was really good, because I think that
this one,
that if you press the button again, what you see is the expanding adult.
You see, this for me is just like what it was, when being with my daughter. And the young children, and they're on my knee, and we're having a little game of horsey, and they're bouncing up and down, and they're giggling and all of that. And then you stop and they say, again, do it again. So we get to do it again with the loops. You just imagine that you're bouncing up and down on a loving parent's knee. That's what we're doing here.
So in doing that, we're becoming less defensive. We're becoming more autonomous. We are not being stuck in those places that we have difficulty getting out of, because we've built a pattern around being defensive, and it opens up opportunities to be more intimate and be closer, and to improve or generate more parts of our positive aspects of our script rather than those defensive parts. So it does leave us more open to intimacy and being in better relationships, more positive relationships.
Well, you might have had enough of what we think. I'm curious. We've got about 10 minutes before we stop, and just interested to know where you're up to. Any final thoughts, reflections? Maybe there's something that you're curious about that you're going to read up on and explore later on. Like, where are you at with it? And so I'm just let's make a little bit of time for kind of concluding comments and checking out. Nikki.
I think what I'm hearing is that positive games are potentially a way of co-regulating. Mm-hmm. But I'm still, I think I'm in a similar place to something Rachel voiced. I'm still struggling with the difference between positive games and autonomy. And Paul, I'm really curious about you saying that, some of these processes we go through feed into a positive script rather than just claiming more autonomy outside of script. That's what I heard. It might not have been what you meant. So I'm confused by that. It's not the way I would see it.
My sense is that as we become autonomous, we become less defensive.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but it was the bit about it filtering into positive script that I was unsure about.
Okay, so, and I think as we do the development that we all doing and that we've all done, we enable ourselves not to be restricted by those archaic traumas and the defensiveness that we built to keep ourselves safe, and to regulate those feelings that we hated to feel. And in doing the supportive bit, our script as a whole becomes less negative, less restrictive, less constricted. And our narrative, our story about ourselves and the world becomes more positive. We can be closer, we can begin to belong, we can be more important than we used to be, because we don't have to defend against those traumas that we all experienced. So
I've got a comment. What I'm wondering, Nikki, is in a way, I must have a sense that we might be agreed about what health looks like.
Mm-hmm.
We might be agreed about, have some shared understanding of what it means to work through traumatic fixated responses.
Mm-hmm.
But what we might be tussling about, having a difference about, is what we might call it or what we might name it. And I think that's fine. I kind of think.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that, Graeme. Yeah. The other thing I would say is I was really interested about the bit about Panskep at the end. So are you thinking of doing something else to link that in and expand that? I'd be interested in that.
Okay, thank you, Nikki.
I think for me, my brain's hurting, but I sort of want to ask the question, how do we define intimacy? And I think that I have this sense that you're working on defining intimacy. So right now, my immediate kind of response is, I want to kind of keep the old category of psychological games in Burns' time structuring way, but I want to rename that dysfunctional intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to rename intimacy functional intimacy, because I think that you're working towards a notion of functional intimacy. So that's what I'm kind of taking away to make sense of this.
Brilliant. I quite like that. I mean, I guess I'm working on a version of the same thing, but might use different terms, and that's what. I can accept that as a way of framing it. Makes sense to me.
That's great, Chris. We've learned something tonight now. Last time Lee was here, he reframed permissions as, what did you reframe them as, Lee?
I can't remember. Something profound, no doubtly.
Something so profound.
Invitations.
In the middle of the night.
Yeah, invitations. You renamed them as, which I thought was superb. Because invitations are not parental and permissions are.
More reflections, wrapping up. What are you taking away?
I'm just thinking, what I'm taking from this is a kind of an affirmation and enrichment of just how important I've thought games were as a theory. And I am still not convinced about the negative positive stuff. I think by creating a distinction in terms of positive games, we take something away from the elegance and the beauty of the original theory. I think what you're talking about is adding a healthier dimension to maybe the perspective of how games are being taught. But I guess in a way, I was always taught that was a sort of traditional way to look at them, and that we actually had moved on. And I think there is something about the aspect of health that's been there as long as I've been studying TA, which is down to people like you and Keith, Graeme, and the Allens, that I think I like us affirming this sort of health and the benefits of understanding how we function. I'm just worried about this sort of the kind of maybe the boundaries that are put in place by using terms like positive and negative within this theory. I prefer health.
Okay. Interesting.
And this has been a really interesting conversation for helping me work that out.
Yes. And if you get any further in your working it out, drop me a line.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pete.
I think I'm with Pete on this. I really like the focus on health as well as pathology, and but the changing of the definition of games and symbiosis to include a positive aspect, I feel like is taking away something from TA, from classical TA, as opposed to adding something to it. So I absolutely like the concepts of positive interdependence and that ongoing nature of positive transactions and communications that leads to greater intimacy and autonomy. I'm just not sure about using the terms games and symbiosis for those concepts.
That makes sense. Sounds like you're in agreement with the meaning, but the terms, that's not just not, it feels more disruptive and unhelpful than helpful. That's fair enough. Thanks, Rachel. And
I'd really like to say thank you to Graeme and Paul for really allowing us to engage with these ideas. I've found it really stimulating and great that we can tussle with these things non-defensively.
Do you know, that's my sense of, I mean, I don't, I'm not pushing the names, but then, the nominals, I don't really care. What matters is often more implicit anyway than any words you use. But my sense of what we've done here is, in a way, I think we've connected well with each other. And because we've done that, we've created enough space to have some tussles and to have some differences. And I think that's great in my book. So thank you.
I mean, clearly, this frame of reference means a lot to you, Graeme, and to you, Paul. And it's been interesting. It's good fun actually. To share and discuss these different approaches. I do actually think that there's an element of rebelliousness in the way that co-creative TA tries to redefine and re-examine certain elements of classical TA. And I think that's an interesting game itself, that little spark of rebellion, like, let's do it differently.
A positive game or a negative game, Alistair?
You choose.
I'll choose the positive. Yeah, thank you. That's true. I mean, it's doing this with the theory, and I do think that the way our discipline will stay alive is if enough people are bothered to put their oar in and kind of nudge it in different directions and keep it up to date in terms of what's happening around, and that might mean more disagreement within the field, but actually at least it's vital and vibrant. So thanks for that, Alistair.
I'm coming away with the discussion and the tussle and the arm elbowing, and just the new way of seeing TA and reframing some of the theory, as in it having a flip side. So there is a positive and there is a negative, there is a pathology and there is a like intimacy and all of that. And I'm quite new out of the education and the study side of it, and only just set up my own private practice. So for me, this is still, I'm not as set, I don't have a path that I'm going down necessarily. I'm kind of open to this at the moment. So this is really kind of helping me to, I suppose, see that there are other sides and there are other ways of looking, and also that in my practice I really try to help the client accept the parts of themselves that they're not so happy with, as well as then helping them with the parts that they are happy with, and helping them to kind of live in both and be okay with both, and letting both kind of be side by side. And so that's why the co-creativeness is helpful, and having a positive or a winning drama triangle for me is kind of helping in some way, to kind of guiding me or challenging me, or can't think of another word, but yeah.
And perhaps hopefully also encouraging you to find your way, whatever that is. You know, it's not this or that, it's just a couple of possibilities amongst many. So wish you well in that journey, Julianne. Thank you. Any final comment before we stop? It's time to wrap up and go and get fed or hang out with the dog or whatever you do for fun.
Thank you very much for a great session.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all. It's been great. So I look forward to the next time I see you in whatever TA gig we meet at. So go well.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Have a good night,
Thank
everybody.
you, Paul. Pleasure to work with you.
You too, Graeme.
Bye.
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 Bye.